On Disrupt Radio, you'll hear George McEncroe.
Moolah, moolah, keep a dollar in your pocket.
I better call Saul. I better call Saul. Better call Saul.
Better call Saul.
You better call Saul.
Gotta love Saul. Saul Eslake is my guest. You will know Saul Eslake from everywhere. He's written about economics for a million years and spoken on the topic. Also, thank you so much for joining me, Saul.
Well, thank you for having me, George, and thanks for making me feel so old.
How could you feel old? You're just a spring chicken. I am really interested in price gouging and where we're at, what's lawful, what's not, because I think people often get outraged, you know, when things are marked up, like I don't know, merchandise at the tennis, or to be able to buy yourself something to eat or drink when you can't bring in your own things yourself. So you are a captive audience. If you do want to have something to drink or to eat at the tennis, you have to buy it there, and same at the football. So, you know, what are the rules and regulations that perhaps we as consumers don't understand all that well, that what is just standard business practice and what is illegal?
Well, George, I'm an economist, not a lawyer, so I wouldn't pretend to be across the fine detail of consumer or advertising laws, and I certainly haven't made a career out of studying these things as, for example, Alan Fels has. I wouldn't claim any of his expertise, but, I mean, the simple fact is, as your introduction made pretty clear, telling lies is against the law in a business context. And, you know, saying that the price of tomatoes has gone up by X% because there's a shortage, if there isn't a shortage, is telling lies. And not only is that morally wrong and ethically wrong, but in a business context, it's legally wrong. It's false advertising. That's a crime, and there are penalties prescribed by the law for it. And you can see evidence of price gouging in some areas, not just the ones that you mentioned, and they're hardly new. They've been going on for as long as I've been attending football or cricket games, for example, which, you know, like commenting on the economy, I've been doing for a fair while. More recently, it's been obvious in the case of airfares. They are now starting to come down, to be sure, but the airlines were completely unapologetic about putting fares up as we emerged from COVID in order to recover some of the losses they had sustained during COVID, even though the government was subsidising them through much of that period. And more recently, it's pretty obvious that insurance companies have been putting up their premiums by more than is necessary to recover the payouts that they've had to make in the wake of a series of cyclones and bushfires and other natural disasters. But if we look more broadly at what the ABS statistics are telling us, it's hard to see evidence that price gouging, lifting prices in order purely to increase profit margins rather than simply to recover increases in costs, has played a significant role in the inflation that we've experienced since the middle of 2022. Over that period, while profit margins of the corporate sector have gone up some, that's almost exclusively been mining companies. And of course, they sell most of their stuff to foreigners rather than to Australians. And the stuff they sell, iron ore and coal and gold and nickel and LNG, doesn't get into the consumer price index here in Australia. If you exclude the mining sector, then profit margins of non-mining companies, which did go up quite a lot during COVID, in part because the government threw lots of money at companies through JobKeeper, when in fact they probably, with the benefit of hindsight, didn't need to, but that went into corporate bottom lines. But since the end of COVID, profit margins outside of the mining sector have gone down. In particular, retail profit margins, which is where a lot of the focus of attention on alleged price gouging is, are lower in the period since inflation started going up in mid-2022 than they were during the COVID period, or indeed before the onset of COVID. So while, as I say, there are undoubtedly some individual instances of price gouging, and some of them have been pretty large, as a generalisation, I think it's wrong to say that the inflation that Australians have been experiencing, the cost of living crisis that many Australian households have been experiencing on a daily, weekly and monthly basis, is primarily due to corporates lining their profits.
So if it's not to do with corporations lining their pockets, is it because wages aren't keeping a pace with the cost of living? Is that the key issue?
Well, there are two dimensions to that. In Australia, it's not really true that increases in wages have been a contributor to inflation, as it is true in the US and the UK and New Zealand. But here, wages growth has been much more sluggish than in those other countries. And I don't think there's really any compelling evidence that increases in wages have been a factor in the inflation we've been experiencing here in Australia. Indeed, looking at it from the other direction, one of the reasons for the cost of living pressures that so many households are experiencing is because wages haven't kept up with increases in prices.
No, that's what I meant. It's the fact that wages are stagnant, that we feel like we're in such a cost of living crisis rather than retailers necessarily gouging, consumers.
That's right. And if you're earning a wage which hasn't risen as fast as prices have risen, and if on top of that you've got a mortgage so that you have been affected by the very significant increases in interest rates, then you really are feeling the pinch. Whereas by contrast, although we normally think that people on pensions and benefits are those Australians who are most doing it tough. In fact, their pensions are indexed in full for inflation every 6 months. So they are getting cost of living relief every 6 months in the form of increases in their pensions and benefits to a much greater extent than people on wages or salaries are getting increases that fully compensate them for increases in the cost of living. What is potentially of concern, and the Reserve Bank has said this, is that if wages were to continue growing at, say, 4% per annum, whilst productivity growth continued to be negative, as it has been over the past year, then wage inflation could become a factor in ongoing inflation of the price of a range of services where wages are the most important costs that businesses face, unlike supermarkets and retailers where the most important cost for them is not labour but the cost to them of the things that they buy in order to sell to us. Those pressures are fading away. It will be important that productivity growth picks up. That is, that management who have the primary responsibility for how efficiently work is done, need to reorganise work in ways that lift productivity rather than seeing it continue to decline, so that we can have decent wage increases that do more than cover increases in the cost of living without resulting in further increases in inflation.